Good afternoon, distinguished guests, fellow colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking time off on a Wednesday afternoon to attend this closed-door dialogue organized by the Social Cohesion Research Program, of which Dr. Leong Chan-Hung is the head. Of course, SCRP is part of RSIS. So the topic is, as Chan-Hung mentioned, fostering inclusion. It's a rare occasion to have this afternoon star-studded cast of speakers like the ones we have today. Lord Elderdice, Professor Catherine Marshall, Professor Mona Siddiqui, Mr. Goh Sin Teck, outstanding individuals in their own right who have contributed significantly to fostering inclusion and cohesion in their respective societies and through their various professional and community activities. It is a privilege that we are able to gather them here today to share with us their invaluable experience and perspectives. Allow me to briefly set the context for today's seminar. The world has changed profoundly, as we know, over the past 6 years, especially from the pandemic in 2020 to the Russia-Ukraine war, conflict in the Middle East, and US-China rivalry. Both domestic and geopolitical events have affected the way we engage with one another, how we look at institutions, and how we more generally think about the future. While sectarian divides along racial and religious lines remain the most influential and brittle components of our social fabric, many new and diverse fault lines shaped by technology, thereby forming online tribal communities, or what the scholar of religion, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, once called email ethnicities, have emerged and with potential to disrupt the harmony and stability of our highly digitally connected and networked societies. Social cohesion is therefore no longer a localized construct bounded by a set of geographical borders or managed under one singular jurisdiction. Given the porosity of trade, transnational movements of people, and cyber interconnectedness, as mentioned, a corrosive hate speech delivered at the opposite end of the world can very well impact a global city like Singapore very much simultaneously. In this respect, I do recall very clearly in March 2019 how the horrific attack by far-right extremists at 2 mosques in New Zealand was live-streamed on social media, and I myself received a video clip of the attack the very same day. We truly are living in a constantly shrinking global village. As a digitally connected global city, Singapore is certainly not immune to such trends. Social divides are certainly not new, and real and serious differences in faith, ethnicity, nationality, or ideologies have always been a part of the human condition. Tribes have fought against each other throughout history. Animosity, distrust, cynicism are all too common outgrowths of the basic in-group, out-group divide that defines us as a species. But notwithstanding the very real impact of all these fault lines, there have also been, I have to say, many instances in the past, or even the present, when communities from vastly different backgrounds were very much able to unite as one to tackle the common challenges of our times. Diversity of views and heritage, therefore, does not automatically mean that there can be no overlap or that we cannot collaborate as a unified whole and foster a sense of cohesion and belongingness. But to achieve this, it is imperative that multicultural communities like Singapore or Southeast Asia and beyond learn how to engage people from other cultural backgrounds in constructive, respectful, and non-judgmental ways. As the Dutch social psychologist Geert Hofstede observed many years ago, too often the default position when we encounter other communities has been what he called, "What is different is dangerous." In a world where global cooperation across racial, religious, and other identity-based divides are simply critical to address cross-cutting problems ranging from climate change and AI, as well as ongoing wars and rapidly evolving forms of terrorism and extremism, we need to do much better. So against this wider backdrop, we at RSIS are very much pleased to provide a platform for intellectual, but hopefully also practical and applied discussions on how to encourage useful intercultural engagements to take place. RSIS, with support from the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, convenes the International Conference on Cohesive Societies, or ICCS for short, a premium global platform for a wide variety of multicultural dialogues. The 3rd edition of ICCS will be held this year. Please do look out for it. To return to today's seminar, we have the honor to hear from leading global scholars and public intellectuals on the contemporary challenges we face. I'm confident that we here, this audience this afternoon, will find this dialogue meaningful and inspiring, and we hope that the conversation on fostering cohesion will continue well after the event ends, no matter where you are. So with that, those remarks, I pass the time back to you, MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction and indeed for the invitation and welcome to be back here in Singapore. It's always a pleasure to join you and particularly to join friends at RSIS. The current divisions across our world have been exacerbated by at least three developments. The speed and spread of technological developments have been such as to create a mixture of excitement and profound anxiety. At the same time, people have little sense that their political and societal leaders really understand the new science and know how to manage its ethical and technological challenges. Worse still, there is a widespread conviction that many of those leaders are corrupt and self-interested in almost every field: business, politics, sport, academia, and even religious institutions. This leaves people feeling vulnerable and with a tendency to identify with those who criticize the established order. They are not necessarily persuaded of an alternative realistic agenda, but they are turning to those who express their anger and sense of betrayal. First, I want to speak about some external influences. There are some serious negative examples for young and old people of attitudes of selfishness in leaders who are concerned only about me. Make America Great Again is characterized by a practical and clearly stated disregard for the well-being of others. This is not only divisive in relations with other countries, but also within any country that adopts such an attitude. The MAGA approach produces the social trap described by Bo Rothstein, resulting from the breakdown of trust, so that people and communities cannot collaborate even when it is in their best interests because of suspicion and selfishness. It deepens divisions based on race, class, religion, and nationality, and appeals to short-term selfish power interests, but leads to overall social and material impoverishment. Some of the same influences who are promoting a MAGA agenda are also trying to divide other countries' relationships with each other by insisting you are either for me or against me. This is particularly against the interests of a country like Singapore that needs to maintain good relations with both East and West. The MAGA approach is also informing policies that consciously undermine global institutions such as the UN, the World Health Organization, international courts. The UN and associated multilateral institutions were brought into being after World War II to prevent a return to global conflict. In their absence, global conflict will almost certainly return. However, there are other traditional and novel transnational networks that can provide better examples of mutually enriching and more trusting relations, such as some of the religious families, environmentalist networks, and indeed the Commonwealth. Singapore has a potential role in many such positive networks. Let me turn now to some internal challenges and influences. Despite the current focus on MAGA-type leadership, there are and have been examples of very positive leadership. The names of people like Nelson Mandela and F.W. Clerk, Bill Clinton, Mikhail Gorbachev, Pope John Paul II, all of these have been what I would call barrier-crossing leaders rather than barrier-bound leaders. Such leaders can appeal beyond their own community to collective identification, that is, a perceived connection with others, and identity fusion, that is, a visceral feeling of oneness with a group, and have demonstrated those connections and a genuine respect and concern for other communities than their own as they seek cross-group cohesion. Research suggests that such leaders are motivated to become barrier crossing leaders because of earlier experiences with others in the out-group. To be successful as leaders, they must impact their followers by drawing attention to shared transformative experience through what they say, do, and organize. I'm thinking here of inspiring oratory, reminding people of common histories, creating new collective experiences such as community rituals, memorials, ceremonies, and other potent cross-community events. These experiences can be marshaled for use in barrier or boundary crossing. However, to be effective, they must exhibit more than mere theoretical knowledge or energetic practical activity. They need to possess what my friend and colleague Mike Cowan calls practical wisdom. Practical wisdom has three key qualities. It is inclusive. It recognizes that individuals and groups have essential differences, but those people with their differences must be included in a community characterized by what Isaiah Berlin called value pluralism. This virtue of inclusivity is not something that can ever be fully achieved. It must be constantly worked at. It's a little like the difference between an institution and a relationship. One is a structure, the other is living and organic. However, while it's important to try to bring along with you as many people as possible, a wise leader realizes that he or she can never include everyone. Practical wisdom also recognizes that an essential feature of the complexity of all life in society is that relationships and societies are constantly changing, contingent, and unpredictable. Even as individuals, we cannot know the ramifications of all our actions, but we can develop foresight through which, by constant and careful evaluation, we can be humbly prepared for eventualities. In addition to inclusivity and foresight, there is a third key element: decisiveness. A wise leader is neither paralyzed by the complexity of life nor driven by wishful thinking about simple answers or an absence of feasible plans. Decisions will often be uncomfortable, but are always necessary. There's an inevitable ethical messiness about public life, characterized as it must be by holding together in creative tension what is good and what is possible, what is faithful to principles, but feasible in practice. We need to accept that while ethical action is always possible, perfection is never possible. There's sometimes a dangerous belief that societal perfection is possible if only one great barrier or obstacle could be overcome. If one ethnic group, one economic class, one religious element, or one state institution deemed to be standing in the way of perfect society could be removed, all would be well. This is extremely dangerous. Now, the most important and common sense of identification is with my own community. But if I can transcend my own community, identity fusion comes about through common suffering and experience of existential threat. These phenomena have been used throughout history, for example, in military institutions to produce a powerful identity. And we saw it at the Hindu temple yesterday, where inflicting bodily pain in a context of powerful auditory and visual stimuli can produce a strong group identity. It's also been shown that identity fusion can transcend boundaries, for example, in the emotional connections that can develop among women who have in common the painful experience of childbirth. Many current external influences on community cohesion are unhelpful. However, if Singapore can help her people see their historic commitment to cohesion through barrier-crossing leadership and practical wisdom as relatively unique qualities in this region and beyond, you may be able to continue to facilitate a sense of collective identity within Singapore society, even if you are faced with existential challenges, as you likely will be, and a pride in your people here in not following a global trend towards the danger of greater division. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I share my thanks to the organizers and my delight to have the privilege of being back in Singapore. It's been too long. We're talking today about some of the complexities of fostering inclusion in diverse societies. And my focus is very much on sort of global priorities and global issues. I've been working for many decades, I hate to admit, on issues of international development, peace, humanitarian, climate change. Peace is obviously a part of the theme here, but so is the broader international development agenda as reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also international humanitarian challenges, climate, etc. These are all we're increasingly aware, deeply interlinked and interconnected. And my focus here is on the religious dimensions, which is what I work on, which overlap in very complex, intricate ways with ethnicity, class, geography, etc. And I think we also need to recognize that we're dealing not only with the contemporary issues of challenges, but also with ancient patterns, of which exclusion, for example, of women, sometimes of youth, is an important part. And I think we're talking today very much with the backdrop of Singapore's rather extraordinary and unusual, deliberate and explicit approach to the underlying issues around social cohesion. It's really been a pleasure to be part of a discussion of topics that are often left to the side because they can be uncomfortable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the interfaith approaches, which is one of the challenges put to me, and then about some of the barriers and some of the opportunities, which is sort of the theme. So interfaith activities are, in a sense, a booming business. I've been working with what we call a network of networks in the context of the G20 interfaith. And there are maybe 30 or 40 different kinds of interreligious structures or organizations, some of which are dealing with the challenge of peace and conflict, climate change, but also with, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets. There's some kind of interreligious approach to each one of them. And there is an appeal of this interfaith world to a number of public figures in the international organizations, in governments, partly because it makes it much easier to deal with what can be a bewildering ecosystem of the world of religion and helps with some of the issues of avoiding favoritism, etc. So that there are these countless different kinds of organizations which go from the very global Religions for Peace, for example, to very, very local. And in fact, the local are probably the most dynamic and the most interesting, and there also are regional manifestations. As a comment here, I want to observe that in many respects, the interreligious, multi-religious world is facing something of a crisis. We're seeing a number of the organizations that have, in one way or another, faced unusual challenges and a lot of skepticism about them. Just to give you some examples, the German government and a couple of others have put a lot of energy behind PARD, the International Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development. The several multinational organizations have focused on CAICID, which has faced challenges. Religions for Peace, the major global interfaith organization, is thriving perhaps, but challenged. Parliament of Religions is perpetual joint learning initiative. So in other words, I think that there is a sense that there is a need to rethink how we're approaching these interreligious organizations, and yet they stand as a vital instrument, part of the relationships that Lord Alderdice has been talking about, as well as the institutional structure. But anyway, coming back to the issues of barriers and opportunities, The idea of engaging religious organizations in global matters is one that has become something that is widely touted and widely acknowledged, but it is one that's been very difficult. We talk about strategic religious engagement. SRE even has its own acronym now. But it is one that is very much challenged by the unstrategic nature of the religious engagement in much of the development agenda, the broad development agenda. So what does that mean? Among other things, it means that it's been very difficult to understand and to have a basic religious literacy about this ecosystem which constitutes religion. So many leaders are uncomfortable for that reason. There also is a rather noteworthy pattern of stop-start. In other words, governments will get very enthusiastic about working with religious organizations or an institution in the UN system. Their successor comes in and the whole thing is dropped. And so you have stop, start, up and down. So what are the reasons for that? And I have sort of very quick 3 Ds and 3 Es, which I'll look at. So the 3 Ds are why the sort of secular world has been so hesitant and so unsystematic in the ways in which they include the religious organizations. And the 3 words are basically that the perception is that religious communities are divisive, defunct, and dangerous. So what does that mean? That they're divisive, that they conflict with each other. There's one report that 78% of coverage of religion in the United States is negative. So that doing as we try in the G20 interfaith to find the best of religion is a constant challenge. Defunct is the old assumption that with development, religion would become less important and more confined to the private space. In other words, that it's not a priority. And yet, as the sociologist Peter Berger has argued, religion is ferociously present in today's world in many different ways and very dynamic ways. And then the third D, the third barrier, is the common perception that much of the religious world is basically inimical to modernization and to the processes of development. And there, I think the most glaring issue is the pattern, the historic patterns of perceptions of the role of women. But many others, the culture wars that we're seeing within the United Nations, what some people call the unholy alliance, which even, for example, is uneasy about resolutions against domestic violence. It can be traced to some of these issues. So what are the 3 Es? Those are the perceptions of religious organizations that make them uneasy in dealing with the more secular world. And the 3 that I'll pick out are: 1, the perception that a lot of the international order is based on empire and is based on a power structure which is inimical to some of the basic values of religious organizations. The sense that comes out of its language to some extent and out of its practices that much of the international order is basically unethical. And then the third is that it is exclusionary, that a lot of what happens leaves many people aside. So I think those are some of the barriers. You also have this sense that there is a secular versus the religious. And in the United States, and I will be cautious about what I say about the dynamic happening in my country, the idea that there has to be a separation of church and state, that you cannot support religion. And there is also a deep fear and a concern that we found in every region of the world about the motivations of religion in terms of expressed as proselytization, But we're seeing it most recently with Vice President Vance in the United States and his tensions with the Catholic Church, where he challenged Catholic charities, basically saying that their motivation is greed, not helping refugees and not helping people. So you also have differences of style. The understanding of dialogue is something that is fundamentally different. You also have the sense of exclusion of smaller traditions and the issues of age and gender, so few women appearing in the religious world. So anyway, those are some of the tensions. So turning to the potential, the first thing I think that we need to remember is that the constant comment of the religious communities is, we were there before you in education, in health, water supply, peace processes. In other words, this sense that they were there, and they say, we will be there long after you, the development world, has left. So I think that there is this sense of continuity and having a pulse on the heart of the community. And that clearly is something that we have missed in our consultations and so forth. There is also an extraordinary field of religiously linked peace-building activities and basically healing, forgiveness of all of the, I think, 30-plus Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have taken place around the world. Many of them are inspired and supported by religious thinking, religious values, etc. But there are other areas. The area that's been the easiest entry point in many respects is health. That's partly because religious organizations, take Indonesia, for example, just since it's nearby, that the actual delivery of health care is provided through religious communities. So that is, but also health practices have so much a link to religious values, but education is another critical area. The issues around protection of the climate and nature, fighting corruption should be one of the primary areas of focus of religious organizations. I think one of the areas where there is a lot of activity, but not necessarily as much action, is on understandings of economic models, the role of the state versus the role of the community, et cetera. So in other words, there are many, many areas and many examples. I would give Pastoral de Criança in Brazil, some of the COVID experience, for example, in the United States. You had Faiths for Vaccines, which was a deliberate effort to encourage communities to be vaccinated, and many other examples. So I'm going to end with a challenge to all of us, which is my personal challenge. The G20 Interfaith Forum is trying to bring the best of the religious community values, which, as I define it, are the care for the most vulnerable in society, trying to bring those into the global agenda. And we are in the process of defining what the priorities for 2025 should be. But just to give you some examples, in Brazil, a global alliance against hunger was launched to try to recover the pace of progress in ending hunger globally. And the question is how to bring the religious communities at many different levels, global, regional, national, and local, into a global alliance to end the problem against hunger. This is by Pope Francis, the Jubilee year, and the question is, how do we deal with the unsustainable debt of so many countries? So that is a critical issue. The issue of trafficking, issues of corruption, the example of the rainforest, and finally, how do we help governments with this social cohesion challenge through education processes? And the Indonesian example of cross-cultural religious literacy is one very interesting example. The Singapore model is one to which we look and has great potential and great interest. So with that, I'll leave that as a challenge. what should and could be the priorities that the religious communities bring. Thank you.
So I want to thank all my colleagues at RSIS, everyone from the person who sent the invitation to the young women who've carried my bags, brought me cups of tea. Thank you so much. I first came to Singapore 20 years ago when my children were very young, and I've been back now, 20 years later, 3 times in the last year, and it feels like there's another family here, so thank you so much. I'm grateful to be part of this conversation, partly because I want to just reflect a little bit on the moral and ethical concepts around social cohesion. And I was asked to speak on this kind of theological and ethical perspectives. And I want to just look at where are the current strengths and challenges that I think I see every time I come to Singapore and have this discussion on social cohesion. I'd like to begin by referring to the remarks given by 2 Singapore leaders who understood the vision and the challenges to the creation and prosperity of Singapore as a multiracial country. The first comments are by the founding father of modern Singapore, former Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who said, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, in 1965, "This is not a Malay nation, this is not a Chinese nation, this is not an Indian nation. Everyone will have his place, equal language, culture, religion." But almost 60 years later, in a recent opening speech delivered by His Excellency President Tharman, who said, "The uncomfortable reality is that history does not progress automatically towards a greater understanding between people of different races or religions, a deeper sense of shared identity or lesser segregation, even as societies advance in wealth. Ethnic prejudices and anxieties are hard to eradicate, and they can easily be aroused or manipulated by sectarian forces, as we have seen in recent years, both in Asia and around the world. So while government policies and community initiatives can set the tone and framework, I think all relations eventually boil down to how we interact with each other on a daily basis. That our moral life is created when and comes into force when someone stands in front of me. That is I am then faced with moral choices. The question is, what makes a people other than having political rights to govern themselves? We can all exist to a certain extent in a physical space, but we do so often as inhabitants rather than as a society. We need to live in a world where values may well collide, but where we are still able to agree on the values that are worth holding on to. And this demands an ethics that takes pluralism of life and values community. So if pluralism is worth preserving, does it have moral weight? I think it does have moral weight. In a speech by Minister Lawrence Wong at the Regardless of Race dialogue, he said, "Since our independence, race has always been a fundamental and central issue in Singapore. Before 1965, we already had many diverse communities that migrated here from different lands and spoke different languages. Harmony in Singapore did not arise naturally between our different ethnic groups. Our founding leaders were determined to confront the dangers of communal strife and to forge a common culture. And that is why they set out from the very beginning to build a multiracial, multi-religious, secular nation. But then communities, however strong and even socially engineered in terms of housing and work, bilingual policies where all students learn English but also study their mother tongue to retain their cultural roots. They have public spaces to interact, like libraries and sports facilities. However much all this enables people to build closer relationships with one another, even to build trust, even these communities will always be vulnerable, because we all have freedom to make choices about how we are with those around us. So if we contend that pluralism and social cohesion are moral goods, then how we manage coexistence is a theological and an ethical issue for all religions. This is so even if pluralism and social cohesion come at the cost of free expression and self-censorship, which can be the concern for many who are both defenders and critics of Singapore's model of multi-faith and multicultural societies. It seems to me that in managing religious communities, Singapore may have made social cohesion its own national religion. When it comes to liberal democracies, they don't require perfect equality, but they do thrive on people of different backgrounds and beliefs being able to live together at some level. And they also rely on everyone to feel that despite all their material as well as cultural differences, they have a stake in the moral life and well-being of the country they call home. I've always taken this to be a given. I've never thought of it as needing a name. Do we need a name for this approach? A recognition that members of a pluralistic society are unlikely to completely agree on everything, but that civility in public life is a fundamental ethic. When religious and other leaders call on the duty to cultivate humility, generosity, and gratitude to create a more positive and empathetic society, they are essentially not doing politics, but calling for moral action. We can't control what happens globally, nor can we control how global religious or ethnic unrest might make us feel about sectarianism in our own societies. But leadership is about managing people's emotions, desires, and anxieties. The state is never neutral on these issues, even if it gives a semblance of being non-interventionist. The question for me always is when I come here is how much can the state control and how desirable is it for it to manage people's emotions if that's what it's doing? As an educator, I often wonder where character formation has disappeared from our curriculum, because I see education as a moral endeavor, good character and good citizenship as connected. It's not only about empathy and generosity of spirit, but fostering a sense of collective responsibility that what I do and say matters to others. In many parts of the world, citizenship is promoted as an automatic right, that given the right passport, we are citizens. What is not discussed is how does one nurture a sense of belonging but also becoming that is a civic duty. And it also begs the question of loyalties. The language of theological ethics should not be replaced or even eclipsed by the social sciences, because it is primarily values and emotions which make us human. And in this respect, I'm curious to know, what is it that each of us feels loyal to? Personally speaking, in my own sort of corner of the world, I do know that being British shouldn't make you feel any less Muslim. The choice between loyalty to the state and loyalty to religion can be false and dangerous. But ideological extremism creates this division, thereby destroying the possibilities of togetherness in a nation. And maybe, I think we need to rethink extremism, that it isn't simply a security issue, that the desire to not live in peace is not an extremist idea, but perhaps more prevalent than we would like to admit. Francis Fukuyama's thesis was that the liberal idea, rather than liberal practice, has become universal. Yet as Fukuyama contends, we may want peaceful lives, but as individuals, we are mostly restless and passionate beings in search of causes. Our primordial instincts for struggle, our restlessness is captured in his bold assertions. And he writes, supposing that the world has becoming filled up, so to speak, with liberal democracies, such that there exists no tyranny and no oppression worthy of the name against which we have to struggle. Experience suggests that even if men cannot struggle on behalf of a just cause, because that just cause was vicious in an earlier generation, then they will struggle against that just cause. They will struggle for the sake of struggle. They will struggle, in other words, out of a certain boredom, for they cannot imagine living in a world without struggle. And if the greater part of the world in which they live is characterized by peaceful and prosperous liberal democracy, then they will struggle against that peace and prosperity and against democracy. It sounds bleak, but I think it also sounds very human. It seems to me that a capable state should not overwhelm society. There should be a balance between risk and trust, because perhaps the biggest threat to cultural or religious cohesion is a gradual erosion of trust. Trust starts with trustworthy political and religious leadership, because in the end, I think trust is a foundational principle that holds together all relationships. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it is rather obvious to you that I'm the odd one out among my panelists. I'm the only local, and also I'm the only one who is not an expert, but more a practitioner in this topic. And so my sharing this afternoon is more of my experience in my daily operation in the newsroom, and how our operation could foster social cohesion, or if you do not get it right, may do harm to our society. When I was a rookie reporter more than 30 years ago, I attended one of the classes conducted by my senior editor. And he tried to explain to us in a very simple way what is the editorial policy of 联合早报. By the way, 联合早报, for those who are, 联合早报 is the Chinese language newspaper in Singapore. And his explanation actually stuck with me, and until this day, I still use his explanation when I conduct similar classes to my younger reporters nowadays. And this is it. He says our editorial policy is very simple. Just follow the traffic light. We know that red light meaning no go, right? Amber light, you think about it, sometimes you go, sometimes you stop. Green light is you go all the way, right? Okay, the editorial policy is very simple. So when it comes to pornographic content that will incite violence, it is a no-go, totally no-go. It is a red light. We are not going to write or publish any content on this. Then he says, what about the amber light? So, 3 issues: race, language, and religion. And you will notice that, in fact, these are the 3 that mentioned in our pledge, right? Regardless of race, language, and religion. But these are sensitive topics, he said, that we should take care in our reporting, in the way we lay out our pages, in the way we put in our headlines, and so on. Then the green lights are others. Then how do we then apply these guidelines into our daily operation? And I thought one easy way and effective way maybe is to show you the headlines that we have. And so I took snapshots of 3 headlines that not only my newspaper but other traditional media publish on crime and court stories. These are the 3 headlines. One of them is in Chinese that was published by my newspaper, but I have it translated in English. I'm not sure whether you can spot a common trait. Can you? PHV driver who bragged he was lucky after raping drunk passenger gets jail. Man arrested for selling traffic police appointment slots. And then delivery man smashes boss's car with axe over pay dispute. You will not find the race of the perpetrator in our headlines. I'm not sure if I do not point this out to you, will you notice that, in fact, if you look through our newspaper, every pages, our court and crime stories, can you find one incident that we actually put the race of the perpetrator into our headline? I would say no, except exceptional cases. And maybe to the readers, it is like, like air. We breathe it every day, but we don't really notice its existence. But it is actually a golden rule in our newsroom, even until today. And why is that so? Firstly, we do, if day in, day out, we read the newspaper casually or the website casually, and we glance through the headlines, and day in, day out, we see a certain race attacking another race, a certain race doing harmful thing to another race, I think in our mind, subconsciously, we think that there must be something wrong between the races, the different races. And this may not be helpful at all in fostering social cohesion. And we are very mindful of that. But as I said, there are exceptions. And just by coincidence, 2 days ago, there was an exception. This is the headline. 2 days ago, the story about a teenager was detained under ISA. And you can read the headline. This story make it to the front page of both the Straits Times and Lianhe Zaobao. Both are the front page lead. Basically, my headline and Straits Times headline, if you can't read the Chinese, it's okay. Because basically, my headline and the English headline are quite identical, except one thing. Can you notice it? The race. The race of that teen was highlighted in my headline, but not in the Straits Times headline. Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Straits Times why they decided not to do so, but I can explain to you why I think it is an exception and worth highlighting the race of the teen. Firstly, it is the first time in Singapore that the self-radicalized person detained by ISA was actually a Chinese. This is the first time, very first time. In the past, when ISD detained somebody else, actually the race are not disclosed in my headline. Of course, when you read the story, you may be able to identify the races, but not in my headline. But this time around, first of all, it is newsworthy, because the first time that we have a Chinese, self-radicalized Chinese detained by ISD. But secondly, I thought it was also important, as a Chinese newspaper, to remind my Chinese-speaking community that the danger of self-radicalized could also happen in our community. Don't always think that this is something that only happen in other races. It also can happen in our race. And I thought it is important to highlight this point. And even they do not have time to read the whole story, at least they know that, this time around, something happened in our Chinese community. So that was the reason why I thought I make it an exception. I purposely put the race into the headline. Well, these are things that we try to do so that we do not add on to the stereotyping of different races. But Besides that, we try to also do positive things to foster mutual understanding and mutual trust. So this is what we do. They are all in Chinese because I want to show you, because I'm sure most of you will read the Straits Times, you know their editorial policy, but you may not be familiar with the Chinese newspaper. Although they are all in Chinese, but from the photograph you will be able to know that, in fact, without fail, every year when it comes to festivities of different races and different religion, we will dutifully report on that. The one on the extreme right, typism, that happened only yesterday. It went to my page 3, and Straits Times actually have a front page story. So in fact, for the traditional media, we are very conscious about, embracing diversity, letting, fostering mutual understanding and mutual respect for different races and different religions. But then the question is, with the emerging of social media, and when you say, because media does not only restrict to traditional media, right? It also refers to the social media. Will the social media follow the same guideline, have the same consciousness about the role they are playing? I'm not here to demonize the social media. People always say, your newspaper men always try to, say about negative things about the social media. But I think one fact remains, that is their algorithm. Their algorithm does not encourage balance and responsible reporting. Why do I say that? I mean, we know how the algorithm in different social media works, based on engagement, based on number of shares. How do you bring up the engagement? Engagement meaning, will people actually comment following your post, right? Normally balanced reporting would be very dull, very boring. So it will not excite any emotion. But if you have a very, provocative headlines, then you will excite people, and then people will leave comments and things like that. And once people do and leave a lot of comments and invite even more comments, your post become viral. Same things. So this is, I think, something that we should watch out for. But of course, social media can also play a very positive role. And in fact, you can find a lot of information, good information, positive information on the social media as well. Because there are also people passionate about this, and they put up a lot of positive examples, positive stories to share with others. But I think that, again, it is the problem of algorithm that you normally will have an echo chamber effect. That you are only talking to the converted. So those people who are not interested in this topic, they will not chance upon those wonderful content. Those who have this inclination of being self-radicalized, they will search for the content, and there are plenty of the content inside. And once the social media notice that you are interested in this, they will send you even more. And that's the problem. That could be the potential problem. We seldom, we have a lot of stories, but we seldom put up commentary on language, religion, and race. Because we think it is a very sensitive topic, we try to stay away from this. But because of social media, we understand that actually Singaporeans appreciate the the space to discuss all this issue quite openly. But I think the problem is that we are still learning on how do we discuss this topic constructively and not going into a very negative mood. And I thought we as a traditional newspaper can play an active role in this. But the problem is that some of the readers, so if we want to become a forum for a dialogue, obviously we cannot have only one voice, right? Then we have to have published commentary from different perspectives, meaning to say there will be contrasting views on certain issues. And some of our readers will not used to this. And when they see something that is not traditionally published by us, they'll say, oh, does that then reflect the editorial position of your newspaper? In fact, it is not. We are just a forum for different views to be at. So this is a challenge, and we are still learning how to conduct this effectively. I will stop here, and then I will take questions if you have any questions on our operation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had four very rich, pretty diverse presentations under the broad rubric of fostering inclusion. Many different strands have been presented, but I think we have an opportunity to try and see whether we can bring some of the ideas together. So one of the, listening to the four presentations, certainly one of the ideas that seem to pop to mind is, of course, currently right now we see international trends, certainly in Western countries, in Europe, certainly most recently in the US, where we are beginning to see a rise of a far-right political movement. Anti-democratic leanings, advocacy of strong states, control, strong state domination. This seems to be something which we actually can see, in Western countries. But so the thing about far right, when we talk about xenophobia, racism, nationalism, that is fostering exclusion. It is not fostering inclusion at all. So I wonder whether speakers, anybody can come in. Well, certainly we have US and UK representatives here. Why do you think the in the last election, what social changes are happening that that has given rise to the these far-right movements? We can get the ball rolling by discussing them, which are fostering exclusion, not inclusion. Perhaps we can start with Lord Allardyce.
Thanks very much, Kumar. Well, as I was commenting in my presentation, I think that there are a lot of fears around amongst people. They see the developments of technology, exciting, but getting to a point of being frightening. If we think of the applications of AI to medicine, they may seem very exciting and positive, but if we think of the applications to defense and the possibility that hypersonic weapons, even nuclear-tipped ones, might be fired by artificial intelligence rather than by human beings, frightening enough that it might be human beings, but somehow that it might go beyond that. This is very frightening. And at the same time, people not confident that their leaders care, that their leaders understand. I think that's one set of things. I think the second thing is that people in their communities feel fearful when there are new groups of people coming in with different sets of values, different cultures, different ways of understanding things. And this isn't just one or two people or just a few. It is that substantial numbers of people are coming in with different sets of ideas. And instead of people being able to get used to this, they get troubled by it. In some places, I think it's true in England in particular, there's also a kind of feeling that a relatively small country is now developing a very large population. And people are fearful of what that means for them. All of these are fears, and when people get frightened, they try to turn to things that will give them some confidence, some certainty in times when you can't be very certain. So they turn to fundamentalist ideas, they turn back to leaders that tell them that they're going to return them to the past, something that they could be confident about, something that wasn't so frightening for them. But I think, too, there has been an attempt by people, what one might call the more progressive end of politics, to push very fast on some developments of culture and community that have left people very unsteadied. And so they then look to certainty and to pull up the drawbridge, as it were, and so when they have people who are saying to them, these governments, you can't trust them, you don't know what's going to happen, turn to me and I will turn the clock back and I will make the country what it was before in the past when you could be confident. And it's a very seductive message. And it's somewhat reminiscent, unfortunately, of the kinds of things that happened in the 1930s, when, of course, there was also a war, a pandemic, all sorts of difficulties. And don't forget, at that time, and sometimes people say, oh, it's all about education, the country with the best and most advanced form of education in the world in the 1930s was Germany, and it didn't insulate them. So when people get very anxious and feelings are very strong, all sorts of things happen, and I think we're in that place at the moment, and we have got to try to pull together and draw back in the way that I was trying to point to there. But it's a challenge, and it's quite a frightening one at the moment, I think.
Thank you. I think we should be careful what we label as far right. Thinking than somebody who might just have a nostalgia for a Europe that once was. And Europe is going through its own soul searching. You know, its past has been in the last few hundred years Christian. What is its future going to be? And does immigration and the inclusion of lots of different religions and cultures dilute Europe's own nostalgia for what it once was? But I think that when you talk about exclusion and inclusion, the irony, well, not the irony, but the reality is that many people who join parties that are talking about exclusion are doing it precisely because they have felt excluded. They have felt that their voices were not listened to by centrist governments or progressive governments. So there's this whole momentum gathering that, hang on, we've been left behind. Now it's our turn. And even if it means latching on to simplistic and ideas about one person might resolve all the issues in society, that gives them a voice. And I think that rather than marginalizing, yes, see these things as a challenge, but there are also challenges on the left of politics as well. And I think it's very easy to, dare I use the word demonize, but to almost mark certain ideologies as very dangerous and everything to the left of that as very progressive. And I think that we need actually deeper conversations on our political life rather than making everything about left or right. or progressive or centrist, because people's emotions and the way they react to things is far more complicated than sometimes what these politicians or these parties actually advocate.
Thanks.
Obviously, there's a tsunami going on in Washington right now, and there is an enormous amount of soul searching as to what happened. And some of it seems fairly obvious, the themes that John has been talking about, particularly the sense, the fear of the hyped up role of immigration and the transformation of the society, and the overshoot of the inclusion, if we dare call it that, movement, have clearly played a role, combined with the unfortunately very skilled and active role of manipulation of media, and that clearly has influenced things. I think we also should not forget the clear role of economics. I mean, it's a little bizarre in Washington to hear people constantly saying that the big problem is the price of eggs. But it is obviously true that a lot of people vote with their pocketbooks, even when in this case, there's no way you can say they didn't know. And then I think we're also clearly seeing something that very few, if any, people truly anticipated in the active destruction of governance mechanisms with the absolutely stunning and vindictive actions on the civil service and on people in different roles. And then from my perspective, the tragic butcher knife that's been taken to the foreign aid and the refugee program. So it does, of course, raise very fundamental questions about where are the values of the society? What good has education done? What good has prosperity done? All of which we've always hoped would lead people in a positive direction towards more inclusive values, more acceptance of others, et cetera. So, as I said, this is a period of tremendous soul searching and agonizing among at least all of the people that are in my circles, personal as well as media and social media, et cetera.
Something to comment on.
A very short one. If we trace back the emergence or the renaissance of the far-right ideology and the emergence of, again, social media, I think they kind of like, if you look at the graph, then it's almost like, they go hand in hand, right? Is this a coincidence? Or should social media play a part in this as well? I leave it to you. But one thing is very obvious is that the politicians all over the world should take responsibility, right? I mean, a lot of politicians, I'm not saying in Singapore, but a lot of politicians in other countries, I think their immediate task is to win the next election. And so if they want to stay in power or to go into power, they have to appeal to the majority. And this may be the easiest way for them to excite, strong emotion and to garner support. Yeah, that's my take.
One of the, listening to the responses is very interesting. I mean, labels are labels. I understand where Prof. Siddiqui is coming at. That's a fair point. Now, reflecting on the Singapore experience, right, at least as long as I can remember, we have, as a nation, we have always tried to be very clear in our minds, at least institutionally as a policy, what Singapore stands for. That's why we have the National Pledge, which was referenced by Mr. Goh, right? Race, language, religion. We are one united people regardless of race, language, and religion. So the self-definition of what Singaporeans and Singapore is supposed to be is relatively clear. All of us, what Singaporeans say you say national pledge when you're young. Uh, so the sense of what a Singaporean is there. So at least in my view as an academic analyst, I think that we kind of have something to hang on to psychologically, emotionally, because of very deliberate attempts in this country at nation building. I mean, Westerners will call it social engineering, but to me it's nation building, fine, right? But in other countries, particularly in the West, right, for example, I come across arguments that, you know, when you talk about British values, for example, what are British values, you know? It really depends on, you know, I think there's a lot of reliance on what we call the marketplace of ideas, right? Contestation between different different narratives. You make it what you want it to be. And because of that, my own analysis, that's where the opening came for very aggressive, extreme left ideas, which, you know, promote, you know, like some people call it wokeism, right? Which one element of wokeism, unfortunately, I wouldn't say one element, but one byproduct of the woke ideology is a lack of patriotism, right? I mean, a lack of, to me, it's not an element, but it's a byproduct, right? I mean, because, you know, there's these elements, some writers on the extreme left, not the progressive left, I think extreme left are saying that, you know, why should we be proud about our history? Because we did a lot of bad things in our history, we shouldn't be proud about history. And I think there's one reason why you have the MAGA movement rising in the US, because, you know, we should be proud of our history. You know, we should be proud of what we achieved in the past, you know. We shouldn't pull down all these statues of all these guys, you know. I mean, we should be proud of them. So to me, one lesson for me as an analyst, I don't know whether the panel agrees, is that before you even think about fostering inclusion, you must be very clear about who you are. So how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I don't like the word woke, so I'm not going to comment on that. I don't think you can ever flatten the public space. If you really are a democratic society where you want people to feel involved and part of the process, it doesn't matter how patriotic you might be, and people do patriotism in different ways. It's not all about flag waving. It's not all about pledging the oath of allegiance every morning in assembly. And the British, I don't know what John thinks, are slightly embarrassed about being very patriotic or showing patriotism in public life, even if they are patriotic. But I think this idea that we have to constantly define what our values are, this is why when people say, what are British values? And British people make fun of people talking about British values. It's very hard, you know, is it the rule of law? Is it a sense of the British queue very well? You know, they have principles in place, they have a sense of fairness, but it's actually very difficult to pinpoint. And you can feel it, you can identify it, but it's very hard to encapsulate. But I do think that saying that, you know, it's about race and religion, etc., does not necessarily mean that people still don't have questions. And so my concern is, I don't think any society has it perfect, nor are we contesting that. But I feel you still have to allow people to raise their concerns. Even if they're living in a country which says these are our values, that doesn't mean that that public square can be flattened and everybody just belongs to that sameness. People have their own ideas about, and yes, absolutely, what you don't want to do is encourage violence of any sort. But I do think that, you know, whether it's called nation building or social engineering, especially in the age of interconnectedness through media, ideas travel even faster, and people are not just defined by the borders of their country. They are stimulated by lots of things that are outside the control of the nation state.
If I could pick up a slightly different kind of aspect of it, it seems to me that life is about relationships at the individual level and at the community level. And if you're going to have a relationship or relationships, to some degree, you have to put some boundaries on what you yourself do. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of hyper-individualism. And there's also been a sense put about that anybody can achieve anything they want if they simply get access to whatever they want and work hard at it. And this is a dangerous illusion. I was never going to be a great sportsman. If I had wanted to be a great sportsman, I needed to get a different set of parents. But the parents that I got gave me completely other kinds of things, which I value very greatly. But it means that there are certain limits on what I can do. And I think the message that has gone out to many people is, no, 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 you can be whatever you like and do whatever you like. And the consequence of this has been to provide people with a false prospectus for their lives, which is focused entirely on them as individuals. And it's important that people have a degree of freedom, and it's important that people are encouraged to follow their own interests and passions. But it's also important to help people understand that if they're going to have relationships with others, they've got to put certain kinds of limits on that, whether that's within a family or a community or a country or whatever. And I think that's one of the dangers about the kind of proposition that has been put around, particularly in the West. One of the things that I think we have forgotten is what it is to be in community. And that's very dangerous, because when you forget that, then the community begins to fracture. And I think you see some of that happening. There are other parts of the world where the opportunity for the individual is completely subsumed by the responsibility to the community. And that's a kind of other extreme, which also has its very great dangers and problems. But I think there is this tension of what it is to be a person and what it is to be a person in relationship with others. And we need to think a lot more about those two things together.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I think that there is underlying the unease and the problems that we have a deep sense of unfairness. And for me, I know with my children, the first thing they learned to say was no, but the second was it's not fair. And I think this sense of fairness is deeply ingrained in people. And there is a sense that the world is unfair and that societies are unfair. And one of the topics I don't think we discuss clearly and well is inequality versus equity and how that plays out. But when you look at the figures of the relationship between CEO salaries and the people and national salaries and the pressures on migration that come from the idea of opportunity elsewhere, when you look at the champion societies of inequality, which are South Africa and Brazil and some of the other neighboring countries, you see the consequences of deeply unequal societies. So I think that this sense of that it's not fair is a deep part of the levels of anger. Whether it makes sense, whether it's rational, is another issue. And yes, everybody can't be everything. I can't be a great piano player either. And there are plenty of things we can't do. But that doesn't go against the idea that of having societies where opportunity means something, and where there is a sense of moving in a positive direction.
I try to take a different take. I think social norm take a long time to forge. And the feeling I get is that we, as a whole, as a nation, we embrace diversity in different cultural practices. That one I think is already ingrained. We welcome that. But I think we are still learning to embrace different values, different opinion. I mean, we talk about mutual understanding and mutual respect among different races, different religion. That one I think we are doing quite okay. But can we apply the same spirit and the same openness to also when some people with different value from ours, different opinion from ours, can we also have the same degree of the mutual respect and mutual understanding? I think this is where we are still learning as a nation.
I want to open the time now for questions from the floor. There are mics at the side, so if you have questions, yes. Who? I think Alami, you want to go first? Yes, Mr. Alami, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to pick up from what Prof. Kumar said, and also what Professor Siddiqui said. When you openly say that history does not progress, you know, to foster social cohesion and inclusion. And I think looking at the world today, the emerging trends are in fact very scary. Lord Aldi's spoke about immigration, you know, and the great replacement theory may happen. You know, I mean, I saw figures from the US, and by 2045, less than half Americans will identify themselves as American if immigration is not abated. You know, I mean, I saw this figure. Leaders, you know, you spoke about leaders also, and we are also at times what some scholars call the Weimar effect or the Weimar era. You know, you spoke about Germany 1920s, and it may be happening today. The emergence of supposedly strong leaders, but who are gangsters, you know, with simplistic solutions which are very attractive to the people, very dangerous. They promote, they preach exclusion, you know, division and so on. And immigration leaders, they spoke about technology, and also, you know, trends which do not really foster inclusion and social cohesion. So my question to the panel is this, because these are happening, it's emerging, and it's going to be a reality, we cannot do our social cohesion project and work and our inclusion how we want to do our inclusion project. You know, Professor Marshall spoke about G20, the challenges faced, you know, in the IRD. So my question is, how do we, you know, relook and rethink very deeply, and how we fundamentally change the whole concept, ideology, the approach of how we want to pursue inclusion and social cohesion. Otherwise, we are just doing the same song and dance, and then we'll just be talking here, year after year, and I think nothing happens. Thank you.
Okay. What do you want to take?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to point out the dangers and the difficulties. And for example, I remember listening to Chancellor Angela clear. And my immediate thought was, that means you're going to be entirely dependent, or very largely dependent, on a combination of good climate and Russian gas. And neither of these are things that you can depend upon. The second thing she said was, with regard to immigration, open the doors, we'll welcome everybody in. And Germany took over 1.25 million people in 12 months, and the result of that, or at least a connection with that, was the rise of the AfD, because you can't do some of these things at that kind of speed. You unsteady people. And that's why I talked about practical wisdom, because there's some kind of balance that you've got to engage in. You can't do all the things you want as fast as you necessarily want. And I do think that we have to now start rethinking some of the ways that we do things. Now, 500 years ago, all the things that I mentioned, new technology developing, at that time it was printing, belief of corruption to leadership, that was very widespread, the sense that the new science was moving ahead of what leaders understood, led to a disruption in religious and political life in Europe, which led to the Protestant Reformation. And that didn't bring peace, stability, and reconciliation. It brought the wars of religion. But at least at that time, people had a clear idea what they wanted to do. They wanted to move from societies dominated by princes and bishops to societies dominated by democracy. And we spent the last few hundred years working out what democracy means. And we got to the other end of that and discovered it didn't actually answer all the questions. The difference between then and now was at that time they had a clear idea what they wanted to move to. At this point, I don't have the sense that we understand what exactly it is we want to move to. We're clear that there's, now, you might get very depressed about that or whatever, but I got quite down about this a few years ago, until I began to realize that it's only when you have to change your perspective that you really do. You know, when it comes to theories in science, for example, you tried the experiment, it didn't quite work. You add a little caveat that said, oh, in such a circumstance, we add this caveat, and then another, and eventually there's so many caveats you just know the theory doesn't work anymore. And it's at that point that you have a paradigm shift in thinking. And I think that's where we are in society. As long as we don't destroy ourselves with either nuclear war or climate catastrophe, we are actually at a point when, if not our generation, but the generation of the younger folk that are around, actually have the opportunity of making a real paradigm shift in the way we understand society and politics, one that goes beyond where we're at. And that's the exciting possibility. It's a challenge, it's not easy, it's not simple, we don't quite know, but it's the possibility that is there because we have to. And that has given me a different kind of hope and perspective and commitment to try to understand how we might move forward to the next way station of our evolution as human society.
Thank you.
The only comment I would make on that is that the predictions are that the change we've seen already is nothing to what's coming. For example, on the climate migration, we haven't even begun to take into account the numbers of people that will be moving. The technological change is accelerating. So yes, we need to rethink, and I don't have the answer to offer.
I sometimes think when we talk about migration, we see it as a recent phenomenon, and actually the history of human race has been a history of migration. It's only recently that we have become more in politics in Western Europe, I would say, in how whether you are loyal to your country, what values you endear to. And I think that we don't talk about migration with the maturity that it needs. You either are on this pro-migration or anti, as if there's nothing in between. But I also think that one of the biggest challenges is the future of how we think of AI, and I'm not afraid of this because I think there's a lot of good that will come. But one of the challenges it will, and we're already seeing this, is whether facts will actually matter, whether truth will actually matter, whether we just believe what we want to believe. And some aspects of AI will accelerate that. And bearing in mind that most things that we do are local. Even if we think in global terms, most changes we can make are local. And this is why, for me, the language of social sciences in talking about social cohesion, I think needs the language of whether social cohesion is a moral endeavor, whether it's really about character and relationships and not just policies that are put into place. It can be both, but I don't think we talk about character and relationships enough in how, with all the challenges of pluralism, with all the rhetoric of divisive politics, you can still feel a sense of security and belonging simply by being with people in a certain way. And so whatever happens abroad and all the big things, yes, they're coming, but they shouldn't necessarily imbalance you to the point where you feel paralyzed by fear. So I think all dialogue, all change, all goodness, all of that is local, and it's up to each of us whether we think that's worth holding on to.
I actually have no answer for the question. It is really beyond me. But I do have what you say about the truth really matters, because this is something that we talk a lot in the newsroom. I think the bottom line is that we must report facts. But reporting facts is not enough, because you only selectively report certain facts could be even more dangerous. Go back to the example of all those headlines. If I run a newspaper and I only name a certain race when the perpetrator is of certain race, I report the facts. I did not fabricate anything, but I only choose to name the race only when a certain race is involved. So is truth matters? Is truth enough? Not good enough. Not good enough. If a blogger, a content creator in a social media choose to only report on certain issues, but not all issues, again, truth may not be good enough. Well,
I agree. And I think I just wanted to add, in the world of education, what has happened is that the world of education, at least in Western countries, has really not been about character formation. It's just been about information. As long as, and that probably applies to media as well, as long as you tell people stuff, there's no story, there's no ethical imperative to choose certain things. I'm not saying that means people are unethical, but that's the way our societies have developed. The modernity is about academia, modernity, telling stuff is all about objectivity, that you can't commit to something. And I think one of the reasons why we're slightly concerned about the rise of certain types of politics is because they're telling a story. And storytelling is very compelling when it comes to winning over human emotion. So if you're telling the story that because these immigrants have come, they've taken away the Britain that we knew, or the West that we know, the West is no longer the white nation, and all the rest of it, it's very appealing to a lot of people. It's very appealing because then you start thinking, yes, that was a better world back then, and this is really a bad world, or this is a world that I feel I don't belong in. So how do you actually say that actually emotions do matter? And you're telling facts, but you're probably you're telling certain things, like you said about that newspaper article, because there's a moral aspect to you choosing to do that. But do we encourage that moral aspect enough? And who decides what is morally good when we are trained, most of us, to think that objectivity is the gold standard?
Okay, I think Mr. Fazlul.
Thank you, Kumar. Fazlur Rahman, I'm here actually as a member of the Coordinating Council for Racial and Religious Harmony Circle. In fact, Professor Siddiq, I like what you said, that social cohesion is a national religion. Because in Singapore's context, I've always been sharing that we are a secular state with a soul, where we're able to practice our religion, respecting the diversity, but do not offending. But you have brought out another perspective to it. Well, something that we can take away with it. But in Singapore, I think we also understand that from the Pew Research Center that Singapore is the most religiously diversified country. Why we have that? One aspect is that we have the state, which is in control of how we interact with each other. We have the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, and now we have recently the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act being passed. People like us who are on the ground, who are actually engaging the various religious groups, the various places of worship. In fact, we are seeing that happening. But moving forward, as we're celebrating Singapore SG60 this year, if we take out the state, equation to strengthen our racial and religious harmony, what more can we do with the people on the ground, especially engaging the young? Because as what we mentioned, in fact, Minister Shanmugam mentioned yesterday, with the disclosure of these detainees, that we can expect a terrorist attack. But before we allow, or where the state has the space to control social cohesion, integration within Singapore, so what more can we as a people do as we forge ahead? That's my first question. Second question, interestingly, you mentioned as whether there's a conflict between being a British and a Muslim. I mean, as a Muslim myself, in fact, when we have some engagement with madrasa students, in fact, that was my first question. Can you be a good Muslim also as a Singaporean? And the answer is that for many of them, yes. So the issue is that how can we do more to have that sense of being in Singapore's context? Because you see some of the arrests because of the conflicts in the Middle East that's affected us here in Singapore. But living in Singapore, because we have a former detainee who says that you cannot be living as a good Muslim under a non-Islamic government, and he's in Melbourne, right? So the question is that then, how can we manage this? In fact, I think just to share, last Saturday, our own Mufti in the one mosque cluster, and he shared about the context of the migration of the early Muslims to Abyssinia, seeking refuge under King Negus, who is a Christian, and then the migration to Medina, where we have already Jews and Christians living in peace. So how do we then contextualize that for our Singaporean Muslims in Singapore? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Well, two very rich questions. Who would like to go?
Let me pick up, if I might, on it, Kumar. I think one of the difficulties I think we get ourselves into with religion and religious faith is that we focus on things like beliefs and doctrines and rituals and liturgies and forms of authority and government. And those are things in which all the religious families disagree. They have different approaches. But there are some things that are pretty common to all religious approaches. And I'd mention two or three. The first is, all of them see humankind as being more than merely economic animals. They see them as having more than that. And yet much of the way society operates is that we are simply economic animals. So I think religion can take us a bit beyond that. The second is something that Mona mentioned, and that is the question of character, morality, ethics. That all the religious families say something about the importance of character building. They may have certain different approaches to it, how to achieve it, for example, but there are certain things there that are of substance and of value. And the third thing that all of them do in a different kind of way is say that there's something beyond me as an individual in the here and now. And it gets interpreted in different ways, but there's something about the transcending of me as an individual in the here and now. And I think that all of those think about these kinds of elements. And it's not easy today to find the opportunity to simply take the time. You know, you've got to get your headline out pronto. You know, you've got to get your press statement out immediately or it doesn't get covered. But taking some time to think about the qualities that we have as human beings beyond the mere hyper-individual economic animal that we sometimes think we are.
Can I answer the question of, and I'm going to speak very personally here. So as someone who is British, who is Muslim, when I first started out as a junior academic and I was asked to do media work, I said, oh, it's taking up so much time away from research. And a colleague of mine who is a Muslim said, you don't have the luxury of not being engaged in public life. You have to say what you have to say. You need to be engaged. And it stayed with me because one of the things I've always thought about is, and more so in recent years, is maybe there are other religious groups that are having this conversation. But when most Western countries talk about the failure of multiculturalism, they're really only talking about the failure of Muslim multiculturalism. They don't say it as explicitly as that, but that's what they're referring to. And I think that whether you agree with that or not, one of the reasons for that is because this kind of questioning, you can't be loyal as a Singaporean and as a Muslim to the state, or how can you be? These always speak about a certain exceptionalism that I don't think you can really foster in a multicultural pluralist, however you understand these words, but where you know that you need a common civic space where everybody learns to get on through compromise, through trust, through reciprocity. And I do worry about that line of questioning has actually not disappeared from third, fourth generation of younger Muslims in the UK or in Western countries. Of course, there are lots and lots who just don't care about these things. They're British, they're Muslim, they're just, happy citizens. But the ones who are talking about this, I don't know whether they really want an answer to that, or they're just saying it because it's a Muslim thing to do. Like constantly question your identity. Which bit of you is Muslim? Which bit of you is British? Or whatever nation state you belong to. I don't think those are very helpful questions. And because they already have the answer in their head. Some people may genuinely be interested, but I think a lot of people want to say that there's something exceptional about being Muslim, that you must be in a Muslim country, or you must reply or answer to a Muslim authority. And those are not things that make sense in a pluralist society to the same extent. Because otherwise, I say this to Muslims all the time, you can be as Muslim or not, or as much Muslim or as little Muslim as you want in the UK. Nobody cares. The only people who care are other Muslims who will judge you. And so the reason why so many Muslims live in the West is actually not for economic reasons. They may have come for economic reasons, but they stay because they have the freedom to be and practice their faith the way they want to. Whether that's good or bad is a different conversation. But I think that we have to not be so disingenuous all the time that somehow we are always living in tension between the nation where we live and the faith that we practice.
Other comments? No. You have a question there. Please briefly identify yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name's Edmund. I'm just wondering, much of the discussion this afternoon has been along the lines of race and religion, which I think are good. But I'm just wondering from the panelists whether you have any insights into what I see as another fault line that could be coming up, surfacing, and that's more from the economic perspective, which is what I call the move from meritocracy to inheritocracy, where it is no longer about us being given equal opportunities, but it really comes down to which family I was born in and passing on an inheritance of generational wealth and so forth. I'm just wondering whether do any of the panelists have any views on that? Yeah.
Thanks. We'll take one more question. I think.
I can. Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. Actually,
maybe
she was first. So can just
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Go ahead, please. Yeah. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Ima. I'm a storyteller. And basically everything that the speakers have said have touched me personally and professionally as well, because what I do is storytelling for social harmony, for social cohesion. But I want to respond to something that Professor Siddiqui said about identity, and I think based on the question that was asked by Fazlur Rahman, it's almost as if we have to choose something. Do we have to choose? I'm Muslim, Malay, I'm Indonesian, I live here in Singapore. Do I have to choose which identity that I am in? Because I feel like that becomes the crux of whatever it is. I am this first, I am that first. And then you end up othering. And I feel like that's what we see in society, is like, you're different from me, therefore I can't relate to you. It seems so simple, but that is what happens. And in Indonesian, we have a saying, tak kenal maka tak sayang. If you don't know them, you can't love them. And so because we're often segregated and stuck in our silos of being our identity, whether we're whatever religion, whatever race, whatever ethnicity, we end up not going outside of our kind of circle. So is it as simple as that? Is that what we have to go back to right now? Because I feel like that's what we're seeing. And the second thing I think is what your statement said, you said earlier about identifying far right or far left. The definition of right and left, I feel, is different among cultures, among countries. I think if you look at rights and lefts in Southeast Asia, I think it's very different than what you see in America or in the UK or in Europe. So I feel like, how do we then kind of explain that in the context of Southeast Asia? I know none of you are from
the politics one I'll leave out. But I do think that most of my friends are non-Muslim. I don't think of them as non-Muslim friends. I think of them as friends. And I think there's a difference between friendship and fellowship. So I've done a lot of work on friendship because I'm always interested in what our friends tell us about who we are as people, the people who we have around our dinner table in our houses. And friendship is usually born out of a certain chemistry between people, male, female, 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 whatever. But fellowship is where you make an effort to be with people who you normally wouldn't have, who you don't, whether it's culture or religion or whatever. And I think that sometimes what we lack is a drive to have fellowship with people. We just think friendship is a new romance. If I could just have a really close best friend, my life would be perfect. And that kind of thing. But actually, most of our lives are taken up by colleagues who are sort of semi-friends, people we meet at conferences who we connect with. And I don't think that most of my life I've ever thought they're different. There's a human connection that you can just strike up, but the moral obligation to have fellowship is something I don't think we discuss enough in society.
Any takers for the interesting question on inheritocracy?
Yeah, well, I think that the issues of inequality and economic welfare and so forth are much more difficult than we often make them. But I'm fascinated by your question, because in theory, we're going the other direction. I mean, in theory, we're going towards societies which are supposed to be more based on merit, with basic opportunities for people coming from very different backgrounds to succeed in their professions. But obviously, with the widening inequalities, we're seeing some trends that are going really in a very different direction. And societies seem to be increasingly reluctant to tax the wealthy, despite the fact that that is sort of the obvious solution. The meritocracy is another one that's being actively debated. What do we actually mean, and what does merit mean? Does it really mean going to only a select number of universities? And the idea of intellectual inequality and discrimination is an interesting one that we're hearing. I must say that I'd really rather that the pilot of the plane that I'm on is selected on their merit and that they're properly trained. And frankly, that's one of the joys of coming to Singapore, is that you have a civil service and a political class that has high standards and that is expected to perform to them. That's not the case everywhere. So I think that we do need to figure out how to balance sort of old-fashioned. Michael Sandel has a very interesting book that's challenging some of the traditional notions and the ways in which the ideals of merit get confounded in inequality and elitism and so forth, and a certain sort of a 3.0 kind of discrimination. But I do think that we do share an ideal, which is, at least in theory, another perhaps I'd add to your religious virtues. Destiny is shaped entirely by where they're born or who their parents are. And that, I think, is one of the concepts that we try to live by, even though we do it very poorly.
Thanks. Time for just two final questions, and the lady over there and Prof. Rohan.
Thank you so much. My name is Mitra. I'm from Kaisi. It's great to be amongst you. Just wanted to bring the conversation back to the title of this session, which is Fostering Inclusion. And I understand that we spend most of the past couple of hours talking about how we are either no longer in a very inclusive society or are slowly shifting away. I wanted to look at the root causes of this, perhaps, and then the fact that perhaps the left, especially in the West, was often describing this notion of inclusion and social harmony or social cohesion as a solution for a healthy democracy, has clearly shown that it's lost its legitimacy in so many ways because of the shift that the majority you have seen throughout, especially Western societies, to the right. And I wonder, to what extent are we, those of us that are academic elites, those of us who are practitioners, are partially to blame because we were closed to those that were not speaking the same language as ours. We were close to the ideas or those that didn't really appreciate this notion of inclusion or felt intimidated by it. More and more when we look at the societies, it's about, did we bridge to those communities, or was our approach, was the approach of the democratic elite, center left or center, more about linking either this notion of join us, we're better, we can rise together and don't join the dark side, or did we even try to bridge? Because it seems like the right had a very good way of trying to bridge to communities that
Mitra,
usually...
sorry, we have to bring it to a
Sorry
close.
about that. Just wanted to touch upon this idea of bridging and linking, whether or not we're doing a good job of doing that as elites. Thank you.
Rohan, Prof. Rohan, he needs a mic. Please be brief. Thanks.
I want to thank Mr. Gosing Tech for highlighting the case of Nick Lee, the 18-year-old Singaporean who was arrested, because his case is truly an exception. There are 3 Singaporeans arrested, 2 who are 16 years old, and in the most recent case was 18-year-old. In many ways, he departed away from being a Singaporean in spirit. He abandoned Singapore heritage. That is why his case is very important for scholars and practitioners of social cohesion. So the right-wing movements are largely Western-centric. There are more than 5,000 right-wing groups that are currently operating in the Western sphere. And a very small number of these groups have started to influence the Singapore communities. But I believe that the threat will increase gradually, especially during this period in Europe and in North America, where right-wing activism is increasing. But if Singapore continues to strengthen its own culture, its own heritage, the threat will not be so much. It is very much like the Muslims. As long as the Singapore Muslims were driven by local and traditional Islam, there was no threat. But the moment Singaporeans traveled to Afghanistan, Pakistan, to the Middle East, they brought those ideologies of Salafi Wahhabism here, and they were influenced. So I thank RSIS, the Dean, EDC, for having this meeting during this period, because this is the best time to reflect on the importance of social cohesion, and the work that we are doing can really stabilize Singapore in the coming months and coming years. Thank you very much.
So as a comment for essentially it's Mitra's question, that's all. Anybody wants to address it? No.
Well, I want to pick up
final
this,
comments.
I want to pick up this question that the previous questioner raised about difference. Cohesion, it seems to me, in a community is about maintaining relationship with those who have different perspectives. And it's not just between, academic elites and the rest of the community. One of the things I like about Oxford is that when you sit down to dinner in the evening, you sit down with somebody here who's a philosopher, somebody here who's an engineer, somebody here who's a doctor, and you're not in the silos that many of our universities are in, where if you're a medic, you only meet medics. If you're an engineer, you only meet engineers. It's crucial that we engage with people who have different perspectives, and that's within the intelligentsia as well as beyond that into the wider community. Because if you realize you need to do that, it is because you value those who have different perspectives and different experiences. And I think that's crucial for community, that you value the difference and you engage with that, but also that you do it with care and concern for the other person. Those seem to me to be two qualities that are crucial for holding communities together. Engaging and having a relationship with those who are different, and having a relationship that is one of care and concern. And those are moral questions, they're faith questions, they're societal questions, and they're crucial questions.
Can I just add, say something that I think will seem very abstract to this particular community? But it is that what we're facing today are problems that would have been unimaginable 50 years ago. The extraordinary progress that the humankind has made in reducing child mortality, reducing maternal mortality, expanding the scope of education to girls, but to people all over the world, offering opportunities, technology, whether it's cell phones or whatever, things that would have been unimaginable. It's not very long ago that a large percentage of the world's population was hungry. So yes, we're facing enormous problems now. People are deeply worried about the loss of birth rates, which is, of course, the success of reduction in family size, which meant that children were dying. So we're facing problems that are basically problems of much more equitable, much more cohesive world. And I don't think we should forget that we have actually made extraordinary progress, and think of it at least in that kind of a context of a changing world.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I think everybody needs a cause. And if you, just bearing in mind what you both asked or touched on, if you're really thinking about how do we strengthen cohesion here, then you have to tell the story of why cohesion matters and what's at stake if you lose social cohesion, however you identify it. And that if it's morally worth holding on to, what are the benefits that everybody is getting out of social cohesion? Because it doesn't matter how much you say it, if people feel that they're being excluded or they're not benefiting from a policy, then they will turn to other causes, they will turn to other narratives. So in a way, at least in the little I know in the Singapore context, I would say if this is the policy and if this is the ideological value-ridden policy, then it has to be told over and over again that this is why it's worth holding on to. Not everybody will agree, But I think if this is what most people are signed up to, then you need to tell that story. And if everyone is benefiting from it in some way. Because if people aren't benefiting, then either you've not told the story properly, or actually it's not a cause that's worth holding on to.
Thank you.
I mean, on the surface, we may think that we are all right in terms of interracial, interreligious relationship. But in fact, there's a danger because of the emergence of identity politics, the renaissance of extreme right ideology. I mean, all this can easily find receptive audience in other parts of the world. But we can see that the trend is also among, I don't know, I may be biased because I'm much older. My sense is that some of the youngsters are finding it fashionable, and that worries me. Because they may not know that simply, buying all these ideas into and put it and try to apply it into our society may actually do more harm than good. But I'm not saying that they have a evil evil agenda. No, I don't think so. They may have passionate about it, but they may not be. Should I use the word? I don't know. Okay, for the better words, maybe they are not mature enough to understand all this complication.
Well, okay, thanks very much. We have come to the end of the event. I'm sure you all agree it's been a very rich session. So please join me in thanking our panelists.